Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. Story 1. The Haunted HOA. The new neighborhood. Jessica and Ryan had just bought their first house in Whispering Pines Estates, a picturesque suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns, cheerful mailboxes, and overly enthusiastic residents. Moving from the city, they were excited for some peace and quiet. What they didn't expect was to be roped into the Whispering Pines HOA, Homeowners Association, on their very first day. Margaret, the HOA president, arrived at their door with a clipboard and an unsettlingly wide smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her eyes glinting with a fervor Jessica found unnerving. Just a few ground rules. No unapproved decorations, no loud noises after 8 p.m., and absolutely no digging in your yard. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Why no digging?" "Neighborhood tradition," Margaret replied briskly before handing them a welcome basket and walking away. Inside the basket was a single candle, a bag of salt, and a small bell. The first incident, the couple's first week in the house, was uneventful, except for the odd sensation that someone or something was watching them. Jessica chalked it up to moving stress, but Ryan wasn't so sure. One evening, while unpacking in the garage, Ryan noticed a strange smell. It was a mix of old socks and sulfur. He followed the smell to a loose floorboard and pried it up, revealing an old, yellowed book bound in what looked disturbingly like leather. "Jessica," he called, "you have to see this." Jessica, skeptical, joined him. The book was covered in strange symbols and smelled even worse than the sulfur. As Ryan flipped through the pages, the garage door slammed shut on its own. The light flickered, and a low growl echoed through the room. "That's it," Jessica said, snatching the book. "We're returning this to Margaret." The HOA meeting. The next day, Jessica and Ryan attended their first HOA meeting, held in Margaret's overly pristine living room. The other residents greeted them with forced smiles, but the atmosphere was tense. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her hands folded. "Let's begin with the agenda," she said. First item, the newcomers found the book. All eyes turned to Jessica and Ryan. "Wait," Jessica said, holding up her hands. "This was just sitting under a floorboard. What's the big deal?" Margaret sighed. "That book is, how do I put this? The cornerstone of our HOA. It keeps the neighborhood safe." "Safe from what?" Ryan asked. Before Margaret could answer, the lights flickered, and a booming voice echoed through the house. "You dared to disturb my slumber." A faintly glowing figure materialized in the corner of the room. It was translucent, with a tattered suit and a scowl that could curdle milk. "Morton," Margaret muttered, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Not again." The ghost of Morton Crenshaw. Morton Crenshaw, as it turned out, was the original developer of Whispering Pines. He had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago, and his spirit had decided to stick around. The HOA's job was not just to manage lawn aesthetics, but to keep Morton appeased. This involved lighting the welcome candles every evening, sprinkling salt around the community garden, and most importantly, never digging in the yards. Morton hated when people disrespected his landscaping. Jessica and Ryan, understandably, thought this was absurd. "We're not ghost wranglers," Jessica said. "Why can't you just, I don't know, exorcise him?" Margaret gave a dry laugh. "We tried. He sent Father Gregory into a hedge maze for 3 days. The poor man still won't touch pruning shears. The lawn of doom. Determined to prove the HOA was overreacting, Ryan decided to mow the lawn, ignoring Margaret's warnings about disturbing the balance. The moment the lawnmower roared to life, the ground shook, and a geyser of dirt erupted in the middle of the yard. Morton appeared, looking furious. "How dare you touch my lawn?" he bellowed, hovering inches from Ryan's face. Jessica grabbed the bell from the welcome basket and rang it frantically. Morton winced, clutching his ears. "I hate that thing," he snarled, disappearing in a puff of smoke. "Okay," Jessica said, panting. "Maybe Margaret has a point. The HOA's big plan." Margaret eventually revealed the HOA's secret plan. Appease Morton long enough to convince him to move on. This required hosting an elaborate dinner party in his honor, complete with his favorite foods, roast duck and strawberry shortcake, and music from his era. Jessica and Ryan reluctantly agreed to help, but things quickly went sideways. The roast duck caught fire, the playlist switched to heavy metal, and someone accidentally spilled salt on Morton's chair. The ghost flew into a rage, causing windows to shatter and furniture to levitate. Ryan, in a moment of desperation, grabbed the book and started reading random passages aloud. To everyone's surprise, Morton froze, his expression softening. That's my will," he said, his voice quivering. I forgot where I put it. The resolution. As it turned out, Morton's unfinished business wasn't about the landscaping or the HOA. It was about his will. He had wanted to leave Whispering Pines to his beloved niece, but had died before he could sign the papers. With the will now recovered, Morton sighed, his ghostly form flickering. "Thank you," he said. "You've given me peace." Margaret, visibly relieved, declared the dinner party a success. Morton vanished in a burst of light, leaving the neighborhood ghost-free for the first time in decades. The aftermath. Jessica and Ryan decided to stay in Whispering Pines, albeit with a newfound respect for the HOA's bizarre rules. Margaret even promoted them to honorary paranormal consultants. Every now and then, though, the sulfur smell would return, and the book would mysteriously reappear. Jessica always made sure to keep a bell close by just in case. Story 2. Zombie Bake-Off. The Undead Invitation. Frank loved baking. It was his one solace in a life that felt otherwise mediocre. By day, he worked as a data entry specialist, typing away in a cubicle under fluorescent lights. But at night, Frank transformed into a culinary artist, whipping up pies, cakes, and pastries that could make anyone's mouth water. So when he received an invitation to the annual neighborhood bake-off, he was thrilled. The bake-off was legendary, attracting contestants from all over the region. Winning it would finally put Frank's baking skills on the map. There was just one odd thing. The bake-off was being held at Grimwood Manor, an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. Frank shrugged it off, figuring the organizers were going for a spooky theme. He had no idea how right he was. The competitors. When Frank arrived at Grimwood Manor with his triple-layered chocolate ganache cake, he was surprised to see how peculiar the other contestants were. There was Mabel, an old woman with a wild mane of gray hair and fingers perpetually dusted with flour. Next to her stood a burly man named Hank, holding what looked like a giant meat pie. At the far end of the room, a young woman named Lily sat nervously with a tray of cupcakes. The room buzzed with conversation, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The contestants' faces were pale, their eyes slightly sunken, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Then the host walked in, a man with a skeletal frame and a sharp, toothy grin. "Welcome, bakers," he said, clapping his hands, "to the Grimwood Annual Zombie Bake-Off. The rules." Frank froze. "Zombie Bake-Off," he whispered to Lily. She nodded, her eyes wide. "I thought it was just a name at first, but they're serious. Look at them." Frank glanced around and realized with horror that some of the contestants weren't just pale. They were decomposing. One man adjusted his apron, causing a chunk of his ear to fall off. Another sneezed, sending a cloud of dust and what looked like a finger bone into the air. "Don't panic," Lily whispered. "Just bake like your life depends on it." "Because it does." The host explained the rules. "Each of you will present your baked goods to our esteemed panel of zombie judges. They're picky eaters, so make it good. Oh, and one more thing," he grinned wider. "If you lose, you join the audience. Forever." The baking begins. The contestants were led into a massive kitchen that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Victorian era. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Frank tried not to gag as he set up his station. The timer started, and chaos ensued. Mabel muttered incantations over her mixing bowl, causing the dough to stir itself. Hank wielded a butcher knife like a battle axe, hacking away at unidentifiable chunks of meat. Meanwhile, Lily whispered to herself, frosting cupcakes with shaky hands. Frank focused on his cake, pouring all his energy into making it perfect. He added layers of rich ganache, delicate piping, and just the right amount of sprinkles. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. The zombie judges. When the timer buzzed, the bakers presented their creations to the judges. 3 zombies who looked like they'd been dead for centuries. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their gnarled hands twitched as they reached for the plates. Mabel went first, presenting a loaf of bread that oozed green slime. The judges took a bite and let out an approving groan. "Delicious." One of them rasped, a piece of moldy bread falling from its mouth. Hank's meat pie was next. The judges tore into it with enthusiasm, their teeth crunching through bone and sinew. "Exquisite," the head judge said, licking his rotting lips. Then it was Frank's turn. He placed his cake on the table, his hands trembling. The judges stared at it for a long moment before leaning in to take a bite. The twist. The judges froze. Their glowing eyes flickered, and for a moment, Frank thought he'd failed. But then they started to cry. Thick, greenish tears rolled down their cheeks as they devoured the cake. "It's beautiful," one judge sobbed. "I haven't tasted something this good since I was alive." Frank let out a relieved laugh. "So I win." The host stepped forward, his grin faltering. "Not so fast. There's one last challenge." The lights dimmed, and a heavy iron door creaked open at the far end of the room. From the shadows emerged a massive zombie, easily 8 feet tall, with arms as thick as tree trunks. Its jaw unhinged as it let out a guttural roar. "Meet Big Z," the host said. "He's our final judge. If he likes your cake, you win. If he doesn't, well, you'll find out." The final bite. Big Z lumbered toward the table, sniffing the air. Frank watched in horror as the enormous zombie picked up his cake with one massive hand and shoved the entire thing into its mouth. There was a tense silence as it chewed. Then Big Z froze. Its eyes bulged, and for a moment, Frank thought it was choking. But then the zombie let out a loud, satisfied belch and gave a thumbs up. "He likes it," the host exclaimed, clapping. Congratulations, Frank. You're this year's champion. The aftermath. The zombies erupted into applause, their decayed hands slapping together in eerie synchronization. The host presented Frank with a golden rolling pin as the grand prize. You're free to go, he said. But remember, you're welcome back anytime. Frank didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the rolling pin and bolted out of Grimwood Manor, vowing never to bake another cake again. But the next day, a package arrived at his apartment. Inside was a note. See you next year, champ. Alongside it was a fresh bag of flour and a single severed finger. Story 3. The Vampire Babysitter. The Craigslist ad. Lucy was desperate for money. Her student loans were piling up, her car had broken down, and her part-time barista job barely paid enough for rent. So when she found a Craigslist ad offering $500 for a single night of babysitting, she jumped on it. The ad was vague. Babysitter needed. 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Well-behaved child. Snacks provided. The house was in an upscale neighborhood, and Lucy figured the job would be a breeze. When she arrived, however, she immediately sensed something was off. The house was massive, with tall, Gothic windows and a wrought iron gate that creaked ominously as it opened. The owner, Mr. Alaric, greeted her at the door. He was pale, impeccably dressed, and had an air of old-world charm that felt out of place in the modern suburbs. "Thank you for coming," he said in a velvety voice. "My son, Victor, is upstairs. He's not like other children." Lucy smiled awkwardly. "Okay. Any special instructions?" "Just keep him occupied," Alaric replied. "And whatever you do, do not let him leave the house." Meeting Victor, Lucy climbed the grand staircase to Victor's room, expecting a rowdy little boy. Instead, she found a solemn child with jet black hair and piercing red eyes sitting in an ornate chair, reading a leather-bound book. "Hi, Victor," Lucy said cheerfully. "I'm Lucy. I'll be your babysitter tonight." Victor looked up, his expression grave. "Do you have snacks?" "Sure," Lucy said, pulling a bag of chips from her backpack. Victor eyed them disdainfully. "I don't eat mortal food," he said. "Mortal food?" Lucy raised an eyebrow. "What are you, a vampire?" Victor closed his book with a dramatic sigh. Obviously, Lucy laughed, assuming he was just playing pretend. "Okay, Dracula Jr., what do you actually want to eat?" Victor leaned closer, his red eyes glinting. "Blood. The strange rules." At first, Lucy thought Victor's vampire act was part of some elaborate game. But the longer she stayed in the house, the weirder things got. All the mirrors were covered, and every room was lit with flickering candles instead of modern lights. The pantry was stocked with jars of red liquid labeled Premium Type O. Victor, meanwhile, continued his theatrics. He refused to sit on the couch, claiming it was too soft, and insisted on playing games like Pin the Stake on the Vampire and Who's Afraid of the Sun? "Do your parents know you're this weird?" Lucy asked. "They encourage it," Victor replied cryptically. "The visitor." Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. Lucy froze, remembering Alaric's warning. Don't let Victor leave the house. She peeked through the peephole and saw a man in a long black cloak standing on the porch. His face was gaunt, and his eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. "Good evening," the man said, his voice like gravel. "I've come to see Victor." Lucy hesitated. "Sorry, no visitors allowed." The man's smile revealed a set of unervingly sharp teeth. "Perhaps you didn't hear me. Let me in." "Nope," Lucy said, slamming the door shut. She turned to Victor, who was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "That was Uncle Gregor," he said. "He's not allowed here." "Why not?" "Because last time, he ate the babysitter." The midnight escape. Lucy decided she'd had enough. She grabbed her phone to call Alaric, but there was no signal. She tried the landline, only to hear static on the other end. Meanwhile, Victor was pacing the room, muttering about needing fresh air. "Okay, new rule," Lucy said. "You're staying in this house, and we're locking all the doors." "You can't lock out Gregor," Victor said ominously. "He always finds a way." Sure enough, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Lucy ran downstairs to find Gregor standing amidst a pile of broken glass, licking his lips. "Ah, fresh prey," he said, stepping toward her. Lucy grabbed a broom and swung it at him. To her shock, the broom snapped in half against his chest. Gregor laughed, his fangs glinting in the candlelight. "Do you really think you can stop me with that?" Victor to the rescue. Just as Gregor lunged, Victor appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a squirt gun. "Back off, Uncle Gregor," he shouted. Gregor turned, bemused. "What are you going to do, boy? Spray me with water?" "It's not water," Victor said smugly. "It's garlic juice." Gregor froze. "You wouldn't dare." Victor squeezed the trigger, and a stream of pungent liquid hit Gregor square in the face. The vampire howled, clutching his smoking skin. "You little brat," he bellowed, stumbling toward the door. Lucy grabbed a jar of premium type O from the pantry and hurled it at Gregor's head. The jar shattered, and Gregor slipped on the spilled liquid, tumbling out the door. "Stay out," Lucy shouted, slamming the door and locking it. The aftermath. Alaric returned home just as the sun was rising, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos. "I trust everything went smoothly?" he asked. "Define smoothly," Lucy said, gesturing to the broken glass and garlic-scented puddle on the floor. Alaric sighed. "I see Gregor paid a visit. I'll have a word with him." Lucy stared at him, dumbfounded. "Your son just sprayed a vampire with garlic juice. What kind of family is this?" Alaric gave her a thin smile. "An unusual one. Thank you for your service. I trust this covers any inconvenience." He handed her a thick envelope stuffed with cash. Lucy quit babysitting that day, but weeks later, she received a package in the mail, a bottle of garlic juice, a wooden stake, and a note that read, "See you next full moon. Victor."